Hi, it's Rhiannon from the Epsom Bakehouse, and in this week's bread making tip I'm going to talk about how much salt you should be putting into your bread dough and why you should be using it when you bake bread. If you're enjoying these tips and you're enjoying watching my YouTube channel, if you're on the YouTube channel, please do hit the subscribe button. And also, if you're enjoying getting more bread baking tips from me and you want to hear more, you can sign up for my bread making tips email and you get my top 5 bread making tips straight to your inbox. You can sign up via the link below this video. So I've just been teaching a baguettes class actually online, and we had a lot of great discussion during the class about putting salt into your bread and potentially how much you need to put in, what kind of salt. And I just thought this is a great question, it's come up before, and so I just thought I'd talk a little bit more about this ingredient that we use in bread making, but perhaps gets slightly less discussed than flour, which people always want to know whether they should be using different types of flour, and of course yeast. I just thought I'd talk about salt today. First of all, why are we putting salt into your bread? So salt has a number of effects when we're baking bread on the dough, and you can certainly test this out. The next time you're baking bread, just don't put the salt in at the start and mix the dough together with everything else that you need to put in. See how it comes out. You'll probably find that it's a more elastic dough and that it might not just be as tight as you expect, might not come together quite as you expect if you baked it before. If you then add the salt in, you will find that the dough will tighten up, and that is one of the reasons we put salt into our bread dough, that it actually tightens up the gluten network that you create inside your dough. And so that is one of the effects of your salt being added. So it helps create that gluten, it helps support that gluten network and strengthen it, and then your dough is more likely to hold the gas, the carbon dioxide gas that the yeast are going to give off as they digest the flour in the dough. Salt will also have an effect on flavour, and if you bake bread without salt, you will notice the difference. There are breads that can be made without salt, but they're generally designed to be eaten with a really hearty dish. Flavour is not from the bread, so if you're wanting flavour in your bread, I would suggest adding some salt at least. However, that probably won't, as it doesn't constitute such a huge ingredient in your bread, where you're looking for flavour is more to do with your flour and the type of flour you buy. So bear that in mind, but salt will certainly add to that flavour. The other thing that salt will do in your dough is it will absorb water and compete with the yeast for water. So yeast need the water in the dough to help them digest and break down the flour to create sugars that they feed on, then they produce gas. Salt competes with yeast for that and creates an environment where there's slightly less water for the yeast to use. So it does slow down the rate of fermentation, the way that your dough rises. So it will have an effect on your dough. That's not a bad thing, can actually help you control the way your dough rises. You might find, again, if you made that dough without salt, it will rise probably a lot more quickly than if you'd added the salt in. So that's a couple of reasons why we put salt in. So flavour, strengthening the gluten network to help your dough rise and retain volume, so retain the gas in your dough, and also having this slowing down effect on the yeast activity. So how much salt should we be putting into the dough? Well, I always say in class that, when I've been teaching online, I do get questions about whether the salt can be reduced. Your salt amount can be reduced in your dough. Normally a bread recipe will have roughly 2% of salt to the flour weight. So for example, if you had 100 grams of flour, you would put 2 grams of salt in. For example, in a standard sandwich loaf recipe, I would have, say, 500 grams of bread flour, and I put 10 grams of salt into that. Now, I appreciate that people want to have perhaps less salt in their diet, so you might think about wanting to lower the amount of salt that you put into your homemade bread. And that's a great reason for baking your own bread as well, of course, that you can control what ingredients you put in, and you can lower that salt amount if you want to. So you could lower it down to between 1.5 and 2% of your flour weight. That's the weight of salt. So you'd be looking at putting in 1.5 to 2 grams in 100 grams. Normally when I say 10 grams of salt, I equate it to about 2 teaspoons of salt in a kind of standard bread loaf. So you'd be cutting it down to maybe 1.5 teaspoons. You don't want to go too little salt. As I mentioned, it makes your bread quite bland, but conversely, you don't want to put too much salt in. Obviously, that will have an effect quite quickly on the taste of your bread. It will come out quite salty again. So if you are finding that, even if you're just following the recipe and you're putting those 10 grams of salt in 500 grams of flour and you're thinking that's too salty, you can cut back the salt. Salt does have an effect on the rate at which your yeast work. So your yeast are digesting the flour and producing gas, and salt will have an effect on that. But you don't really have to worry too much about mixing the salt and yeast. Now, if you were to dissolve your yeast in water and then pile in many teaspoons of salt, mix it up into that water, the salt would obviously dissolve in the water too, and the yeast will be able to absorb it as they're dissolved into the water, and that probably would start to kill off the function of the yeast. But if you've got dry salt and dry yeast, just mix them into the flour before you add the water, and that'll be absolutely fine. In terms of what salt to use, to be honest, that's a pretty personal preference. If you've just got basic table salt, and that's what I tend to use when I'm running classes, it will have some anti-caking agent to make sure it doesn't all clump together and still runs out of the packet. So you might want to, if you don't want any of those additives, you might want to use, say for example, sea salt flakes, something like that, which is pure salt. You will have to usually grind those down a little bit because they're too chunky to be dissolved into your dough. So that's just been a little bit about baking with salt in your bread, how much you should use and why you should use it and when you're baking bread. I hope it's been helpful. If you've got any questions, do leave a comment under this video or send me an email. I love to hear from you and your bread making questions. And as I mentioned at the top of the video, if you want to get more bread making tips, you can sign up to my bread making tips email. You get to my top 5 bread making tips straight to your inbox, and the link for that is below this video. If you've enjoyed, please do hit subscribe, and I will see you back here for another bread making tip. I will say bye for now and happy baking.